Welcome to the On List. Today we are talking about violet. Yes, the note of violet. Not so much the specific flower, but just violet as a note, a material, a subject in perfumes. So violet is one of my favorite notes and subjects in perfume, but unlike rose or jasmine or even lavender that seem just evergreen in their popularity, it's one of those things that comes and goes. There's a period where violet is very popular, and then a period where it goes away again, and then a few decades later, you see it pop back up. So it's something that is not always in style, but when it is, violet seems to be very intensely in style. It's sort of a similar way as a few other florals that come and go. Like tuberose has its days in the sun, and then it goes away again, becomes more of a background player, then reemerges. That's how violet seems to be. Now, violet also has a very interesting history as both a material and a note, because violet, just like lily of the valley or muget, was traditionally a notorious flower to extract any real essence from. Now you have to understand, before all these synthetic materials came around, the only real way to get essence from a flower was through tinctures, through infusions, maceration techniques, ways to sort of submerge the flower in a material that would absorb its odors and then distill that material down so it could become an ingredient to place in another medium like alcohol for perfume. So one of the ways you could get essences from flowers was through enfleurage. And enfleurage was basically submerging the flower in some kind of animal fat. And then after it sat in the animal fat and macerated for a long time, you would then run the animal fat through an alcohol bath, which would then extract the essence, and then you could distill that down into some kind of absolute oil. And that worked for a lot of flowers. But with violet, you would have to do it over and over and over again. And the amount of labor that went into it for the amount of yield you got in return was extremely wasteful. So violet, due to its difficulty in procurement, became a bit of a status symbol. Just in the same way that today a lot of niche perfumes of a certain type tend to have like a flex factor, like when you wear BR 540 or Ventus, people know you've got money because they recognize those smells as being, smells of expensive perfumes. Well, violet was very difficult to actually get. So anyone who could afford to smell like violets at one point in time was basically saying, I've got a lot of money, I've got a lot of power, I can afford to smell like violets, which is a really difficult thing to do. And Napoleon was infamously, I don't know. My mouth is just like, I'm having a lot of malfunctions today. I don't know. Maybe I didn't have enough caffeine. Who's to say? Things are a little bit slow up here, and the connection's a bit laggy. But I'm doing my best, guys. Really, I'm doing my best. So Napoleon was fairly infamous for his love of violet. And he would, of course, spend all of France's money, because he was the emperor of France, right? He would spend all of France's money procuring various violet tinctures and perfumes, and then he would apply them with abandon, splash them everywhere. So if Napoleon wasn't bathing in eau de cologne, another thing he was famous for, filling an entire bathtub with eau de cologne and then soaking in it. If he didn't smell like Neroli or some other eau de cologne subject, likely he smelled like violets. So either way, he reeked of something. Okay, guys? He reeked of something. Eventually, though, people came to realize that you could get a lot more compound from the leaf of the violet flower than from the petals. Even though you got a more delicate floral scent from the petals, you could get more just straight odor, period, from the leaves. So we began to see the enfleurage technique, the maceration technique used on the violet leaves instead, which it does produce a recognizable violet smell, but a much grassier, leafier, stemmier smell, like the kind of smell you would expect from chlorophyll, or like for a chemical comparison, cis-3-hexanol, or something along those lines, vetiver acetate, maybe galbanum in some ways, but not quite, because galbanum is very sticky smelling. But you could get a much more intense violet aroma from the violet leaf through that enfleurage process, but it wasn't as floral anymore. It didn't have the delicacy people wanted from the smell of the actual violet flower. So it kind of, it was sort of a second best situation. Like, okay, well, we'll make do with this because this is all we have, right? Now, the late 19th century, once we started seeing perfume chemistry really pick up, with the volatile compounds like various gases to extract coumarin from tonka bean, right? That's where we got our big coumarin notes and stuff like Fougere Royale in 1882. Around this same time, we would see the creation of Ionones. And they would use acetone and a few other materials to basically create the Ionones from natural compounds. And of the isolations, you would have your alpha and beta Ionones, which have the floral and woody fruity aspects of the smell, respectively, alpha and beta. A lot of synthetic violet notes would suddenly hit the market because they began to realize they could combine the alpha and beta Ionones together to make a believable violet note really cheaply and easily. This opened the floodgates, okay, on the violet perfumes. Once they figured out the alpha beta Ionones could be used to create believable violet materials, suddenly you saw violet flavored candies. You guys remember those? The Parma violets, the little rolls of the purple candies. They kind of remind you of grape a little bit, but not exactly. Well, there you go. That's flavored with Ionones. They're not putting real violet leaf in those candies, guys. That's why they're inexpensive. If they had real violet leaf essence, they'd be a lot more bitter, first of all. They'd be a lot more bitter, and two, they'd be really expensive. So they used the Ionones to flavor the candies. And then, of course, they also found their way into perfumes. And suddenly a lot of violet fragrances hit the market in that late 19th century period, or a lot of other fragrances, particularly your classic Guerlains, your classic Carons, Coty fragrances, fragrances from Chirius and Parfums de Rosine and Petou and all these other ones began to have very prominent violet notes in them, thanks to the Ionones. Now, later on, we'd see the isomethyl Ionones, which are much more powdery, right? Different subject for a different video. But the alpha isomethyl Ionones, or the methyl Ionones, they produce the iris notes, the irisy, powdery notes that you get in your makeup and such. So do not confuse the Ionones with the isomethyl Ionones or the methyl Ionones. They are different, okay? But the alpha and beta Ionones are responsible for the violet smell in the vast majority of the violet perfumes you are going to find on the market. Now, violet started to become more of a masculine thing into the 70s and 80s because greener fragrances in general became more popular, and guys in particular loved the green, outdoorsy smelling stuff. So it didn't take long for someone to realize, hey, we can put violet notes in here, especially if we're using the violet leaf notes, right? Which again, it's a more expensive process because now we're using the violet leaf absolute, but we can either create a real violet leaf note or fake one out with the Ionones, one way or the other, and we could produce a very green smell that is floral, but not so floral that guys with that machismo vibe would be objectionable to it, okay? So thus we started seeing things like gray flannel hit the market. Strong violet presence, right? And then, of course, you can also combine violet materials with a few other chemicals that I'm not going to name because they're very long and it's pedantic, and this video is already a bit sciencey as is, right? I don't want to get too sciencey on you guys, but you can mix other materials with your ionones and create more of a petrol, gas, benzene kind of violet vibe. And that's where you get your stuff like what? Fahrenheit, right? With its infamous beryl note, which is a whole mess of things. That beryl note, if you look at it, the chemicals that comprise it, it's a whole mess of things. But violet is a part of that mixture. Fahrenheit deserves its own video, so again, I will do that separately. Won't get into that here. But violet and violet leaf in general became a more popular mainstay of men's fragrances, starting with fragrances like gray flannel in the 70s. Eventually, things like green Irish tweed in the mid-80s by Creed, one of the earliest success stories for the house. And then later we would see that turn up again with cool water, which even though cool water is more along the lavender aspect, it's relatively the same composition as green Irish tweed, but some key tweaks. Say Perfumer, right? That's also a story that could be told in its own video. But point is, the violet notes became really popular. And then again, it became hit or miss into the 90s and 2000s. You know, we'd have a little run with Khitan would put out a fragrance for men that had a prominent violet note in it. Late 90s, we would see Burberry would come out with Touch, which was another fragrance for men that had a prominent violet note. Cartier would have a unisex fragrance called Eau de Cartier, and an Eau de Cartier Concentré, 2002. Actually, it's an early Christine Nagel composition, sadly discontinued, but it also had a very leafy, prominent violet note that was also combined with lavender. So it was lavender, violet, green, violet leaf, lavender mixture. And then straight on through to today, okay? Straight on through till today, we still have violet fragrances. Middle Eastern fragrances sometimes like to bash violet in with oud because violet has that, again, fruity floral profile, right? And that lends itself really well to a more sort of oily, woody, petrolish, musky oud profile. So Mancera actually has an oud violet or a oud violet that I own and I find particularly well done. Now, some fragrances really lean more into the beta-ionone aspect of the ionone pairing to create the violet notes, and that starts to make a much fruitier violet profile than perhaps some may be used to. When you see that, though, it does create some interesting fragrances, whether they're on the male side or female side of the market, I don't really care. But the fruitier violet materials, when they turn up, are pretty interesting. And a lot of times we call them grape fragrances, right? We're like, this smells like grape, because they do kind of impart a bit of a grapish vibe to them. One example would be a discontinued fragrance from Versace, just called Versace Man. It's from 2003, I believe, 2003. And it has that fruitier violet aspect, but it also has a lot of saffron material in it and a lot of vanilla in it. So even though it does go down that green, grassy, fruity, grape-ish feeling with the way the ionones are approached, because it has those saffron materials, those real ambery materials, a tobacco note is in there, it's a lot smoother than you might think a fragrance like that would be. But it is still got that little bit of grape-ish feeling, and it's an interesting fragrance. Another example of that would be Silver Scent by Jacques Bogart, one that a lot of people actually look past, which is really unfair to the fragrance. They look past it because it's Bogart, and thus, well, it's got to be garbage, right? It's cheap, it's Bogart. But it's a really interesting, unique fragrance. Bogart Silver Scent. A lot of people complain that it's very grapey, And I guess, yeah, it's again leaning into the fruitier aspect of the violet Ionone mixture. But if you want a more upmarket version of that silver scent, if you like that silver scent, but you have scruples, you have standards, you can't be caught wearing cheap fragrances. Oh no, you got to wear expensive ones. Well, I've got an option for you. And I've got the bottle right here, actually. Let me break it out. I've still got the box here because it's one I was photographing earlier before I decided to make a video. And this one is Hommage L'Homme. Hommage à l'Homme. Okay, it's again, I butcher the French really bad, but Hommage à l'Homme by Lalique. Sadly discontinued, which automatically makes it more expensive than the silver scent, because the silver scent is not discontinued, so you can reasonably find it. But if you're able to get your hands on a bottle of this, it's going to cost you more than silver scent, clearly. And now that's discontinued, it may cost you even more, and thus maybe sort of not be worth it, depending on how much of an obsessive collector you are and need to have all the things that you can't have anymore. That FOMO thing kicks in real bad. But this is definitely a more upscale, upmarket take on what silver scent is trying to do. So it's got a woody profile like silver scent, less on the tobacco tonka and more on the woodiness, though. The vetiver is in here in full force, the cedarwood materials. More iso-y super for sure. But it does have that bit of a grapish, fruity, but also green, leafy. It's actually a split down the middle, really, on the aspect of violet you get. But it's another primarily violet fragrance. And Michael Almirac, who's, or Mikhail technically, I've been saying his name wrong all these years. It's technically, it's Mikhail Almirac. He likes to play with violet materials. He's been a really big proponent on violet fragrances. A lot of the work you see on the prominent violet fragrances usually has his name attached to it. He was one of the three noses on Fahrenheit, for example. He was one of the three noses on that. And, well, he's also one of the noses of this fragrance, too. So where you find a good violet note, you typically find him. He's typically, Mr. Almirac's typically responsible for the violet, and he did his work here. He also would do a prominent violet fragrance for Brioni, just called Brioni, and that's sort of a spiritual successor to Fahrenheit. Imagine a cooler, bluer, more aquatic take on the Fahrenheit vibe. Less petrol, more green. That's Brioni, another fantastic violet fragrance that Michael Almirac has put his name on. So, yeah, again, most of the violet fragrances that seem to come out are very niche interest, and they don't typically last on the market for all that long, which is unfortunate, really. It's really kind of sad. They get discontinued. Another one would be another Bogart fragrance I can think of. It's called Riviera Nights. Now, it was part of a pair. You've got Arabian Nights on one hand, which was more of a floral leather fragrance. Then you've got Riviera Nights on the other hand. And the Riviera Nights, once again, had a very grapish, sort of fruity approach to violet. The Parma Violet candy style of violet. But it's a good scent. It's a good scent. I like it. I think it's worth checking out. If you can find a bottle and, like I said, not lose a kidney in the process. And there are tons of niche violet fragrances because a niche is niche, right? Again, it's a more exclusive world, so they're not as keen on sales figures being high, right? They don't produce high quantities of bottles to begin with. So if you're looking for your violet fix and all of your favorite commercial violet fragrances have gone away, then you can check out a lot of various niche brands. Now, there is also an artisanal fragrance. It's an indie fragrance by Darren Allen called Sweet Repose. I'm not the biggest fan of it, but it has a very realistic Parma violet candy feel, and it uses real violet materials. It's not just Ionones. So it's a mixture. it's a mixed media. It's natural and synthetic, but if you're looking for more of that Victorian era Parma violet, sweet violet candy kind of feeling, once more, that's one for you to check out that I think you would enjoy. I tend to like my violet fragrances a little more on that greener side. Not always petrol. Doesn't always have to be a petrol violet like a Fahrenheit violet, but those are nice too. There's a little known flanker to Bora Bora. Those of you who watched my previous video on Liz Claiborne, you know I mentioned Bora Bora in that video, right? Well, after Liz Claiborne died, this is sort of an addendum to that, but after Liz Claiborne died, the Claiborne Cosmetics brand pushed out a ton of flankers for its established lines, I guess to move them away from the curve feeling, since I mentioned in that video how a lot of the later Claiborne releases all felt like variations of curve, like Mambo was the spicy curve, right? So the flankers, when they came out, were mostly unrelated to the original release, but distanced those releases from the curve association. So in the case of the flanker to Bora Bora, which was called Bora Bora Exotic, by the way, Bora Bora Exotic came in a blue bottle, and you would look at it and think, oh, this is some generic aquatic, right? I'm not going to mess with this. It's aquatic. But actually, it was a very nostril-burning, petrolish, very harsh green, super sharp petrol violet. It's almost like a blue flame rendition of Fahrenheit. You know, it doesn't have the vanilla that Fahrenheit has, doesn't have the roundness that Fahrenheit has. It just straight punches you in the face with the really harsh, you know, green gasoline violets. So if you want that extreme experience, pick you up a bottle of the Bora Bora Exotic. And just remember, it doesn't smell like it looks like it smells. It smells nothing like how the bottle appears. And it will take you for a ride, I will say that. That about wraps it up, guys. Let me know what your feeling is on violet perfumes. Do you like Green Irish Tweed? One of the best representations of that violet leaf that I can find, you know, it's more subtle and airy. You know, do you want more of your Parma violet candy style violets? Are you into more of the traditional floral violet, which is sort of a dying breed? Don't see that too much. Jolie Madame, which is a feminine fragrance by Balmain. Balmain released it, and Jolie Madame actually had a nice sort of rounded violet feel in it as well. It was not strictly a violet fragrance, but it had a nice violet feel, more of that floral violet. But again, discontinued. If you find it, it's going to cost you a lot of money. Same thing with a lot of the early 20th century violet fragrances. A lot of them are dead and gone. But just again, let me know what your feeling on violet is, whether you like it, whether you don't like it, what your favorite types are. And this has been the Unlist. I hope you enjoyed it.